October 25th, 1944. The waters off Samar Island are glass smooth, a deceptive calm that belies the storm about to break. Vice Admiral Kurita stands on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever built, and feels something he hasn't felt in years. Certainty. Through his binoculars he can see them, 6 small shapes on the horizon. American escort carriers, the jeep carriers, floating airfields so lightly armoured a cruiser shell could punch clean through them like tissue paper. They're fat, slow, and completely helpless. Between his fleet and those carriers stand 7 destroyers. Not fleet destroyers, not even proper warships. Destroyer escorts and destroyers so small, so pathetically undergunned that his officers are actually laughing. His chief gunnery officer, Commander Tonosuke Otani, lowers his own binoculars and makes a joke that ripples through the bridge. "Tin cans," he says, using the American slang with contempt. They send tin cans to fight the combined fleet. The laughter is real. It's the laughter of men who know they hold every single advantage. Kurita commands 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. His Yamato alone displaces 72,000 tons and carries 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighs 3,200 pounds, more than an entire American torpedo boat. His fleet represents the concentrated naval power of an empire. Those 7 American ships, those tin cans, have a combined displacement less than a single one of his battleships. The largest of them, USS Johnston, weighs just 2,700 tons. It's a David and Goliath story, except this time David brought a slingshot to a tank battle. What Takeo Kurita and every man on that bridge couldn't possibly know, what the laughter prevented them from understanding, was that they were about to witness something that would become legend. In less than 90 minutes, those 7 tin cans would do the impossible. They would turn the greatest surface fleet action of the Pacific War into a chaotic nightmare. They would damage 3 heavy cruisers so badly they'd limp away from the battle. They would sink or cripple ships 10 times their size. And 3 of those small, insignificant destroyers would put torpedoes into Japanese carriers with such precision, such audacity, that they would send them to the bottom in the span of a single morning. The laughter on the Yamato's bridge was about to die in the roar of 5-inch guns firing at point-blank range against battleship armour. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a bar fight where the small guy refused to stay down, and by the time it was over, the biggest fleet Japan had assembled would be running for its life. To understand the sheer impossibility of what happened off Samar, you first have to understand what a destroyer escort actually was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. In 1942, America had a problem that was killing thousands of sailors. German U-boats were massacring merchant convoys in the Atlantic at a staggering rate. In the first 6 months of that year alone, over 600 Allied ships went to the bottom. The solution was convoy escort, but America didn't have enough destroyers. Destroyers were complex, expensive, and took over a year to build, so the Navy created a compromise: a cheap, simple, mass-produced warship that could be built in 3 months. The Destroyer Escort, or DE. They stripped out everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. The DE carried only 2 5-inch guns compared to a destroyer's 5. Its engines were diesel or turbine electric, not the powerful steam turbines of fleet destroyers, limiting its top speed to just 24 knots. A real destroyer could make 35. Its armour was minimal, barely enough to stop machine gun fire. Its mission was simple: protect slow merchant ships from submarines, hunt U-boats in the Atlantic, screen convoys. These were not combat warships. They were sheepdogs, not wolves. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, the commanding officer of the destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, once described his ship with brutal honesty. The Samuel B. Roberts was designed to fight submarines in the North Atlantic, he wrote to his wife. She has guns big enough to hurt surfaced U-boats. Her torpedoes are meant for cargo ships or submarines. She was never, ever meant to engage surface combatants, let alone battleships. The actual fleet destroyers assigned to Taffy 3, the escort carrier group off Samar, weren't much better. Ships like USS Johnston, USS Hurl, and USS Heermann were Fletcher-class destroyers, good ships, but they were built for anti-aircraft work and submarine hunting, not ship-to-ship combat with capital ships. They carried 5 5-inch guns, decent for their size, but those guns fired 55-pound shells. The Yamato's main guns fired shells 60 times heavier. They had 10 torpedoes, their only real weapon against big ships, but they had to get suicidally close to use them within 10,000 yards, less than 6 miles. That meant charging directly at ships that could kill them from 20 miles away. The Japanese called destroyers tin cans for good reason. They had no armour to speak of. A battleship shell hitting a destroyer didn't just damage it. It passed clean through one side and out the other, often without even detonating, because the shell's fuse was set for thick armour, not thin steel. But when those shells did explode, they turned destroyers into scrap metal in seconds. So when Admiral Kurita's lookouts spotted Taffy 3 at dawn on October 25, 1944, the mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. The Japanese had overwhelming firepower, overwhelming armour, and overwhelming numbers. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, looked at the range estimates coming from his radar operators and felt his stomach drop. His 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcon Bay, Gambier Bay, and St. Lo, were floating warehouses. They were built on merchant ship hulls, carried just a single 5-inch gun, and had a top speed of 17 knots. They were so lightly built that their crews joked you could put your fist through the hull plating. They couldn't fight, and they couldn't run. His screening force was 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 7 small ships to protect 6 defenseless carriers against the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. The only rational move was to run. Order his carriers to turn away at maximum speed and pray that American reinforcements arrived before Kurita's battleships got in range. But there was a problem. Kurita was positioned between Taffy 3 and the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf, where 200,000 American soldiers were unloading onto the beaches with minimal naval protection. If Sprague ran, if his carriers scattered and fled, Kurita's fleet would proceed unmolested to Leyte Gulf. They would bombard the beaches. They would sink the thin-skinned transports. They would massacre the landing force. Thousands of Americans would die. So Sprague made a decision that seemed insane. He ordered his carriers to run, yes, but not away from the battle. He ordered them to head into the wind to launch their aircraft, which meant turning toward the Japanese fleet. And he gave an order to his screening destroyers that was essentially a death sentence. Small boys, attack! Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans was already moving before the order came. Evans was a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, a man known for aggressive tactics and a complete disregard for caution. At his change of command ceremony a year earlier, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." Now he had his chance. The Japanese fleet was 18 miles away and closing at 30 knots. Their heavy cruisers had already opened fire, and 14-inch shells were throwing up massive waterspouts around the American carriers. In a rational world, Johnston should have laid smoke to hide the carriers and waited for orders. Instead, Evans turned his ship directly toward the Japanese fleet and called down to his engine room. "All ahead flank! I want every revolution you can give me." He was charging 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers in a single 2,700-ton destroyer. His executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, stood next to him on the bridge, doing the math in his head. The Yamato's 18.1-inch guns had a range of 26 miles. The Congo-class battleships had 14-inch guns with a 20-mile range. The heavy cruisers had 8-inch guns, effective to 18 miles. Johnston's 5-inch guns could reach, at most, 10 miles, and even then, they'd barely dent a cruiser's armour. To use their torpedoes, they had to close to 6 miles or less. That meant running 12 miles through a gauntlet of fire from ships that could kill them with a single hit. "Skipper," Hagen said, "this is going to hurt." Evans didn't look away from the enemy fleet. That's why they put the armour on the outside and the guts on the inside. Johnston accelerated to 35 knots, her engines screaming. The Johnston's crew was laying smoke as they went, thick black chemical smoke that billowed from generators on the deck, creating a screen between the carriers and the Japanese fleet. But Evans wasn't hiding behind it. He was using it as cover for his attack run. At 14 miles, the Japanese heavy cruisers spotted Johnston and shifted fire. Commander Otani, aboard Yamato, watched in disbelief. "A destroyer is charging us," he reported to Kurita. "Alone." Kurita raised his binoculars. He could see the single American ship, a tiny grey shape, throwing up a massive bow wave, heading directly toward his battle line at maximum speed. It was suicide. It was also a violation of every tactical doctrine. Destroyers didn't charge battle lines. They laid smoke, fired torpedoes from maximum range, and fled. This destroyer was doing the opposite. "Foolish," Kurita said. But there was something in his voice, a hesitation. This wasn't the American Navy he knew. American doctrine was cautious, methodical. This was something else. This was desperation or insanity, and he wasn't sure which was more dangerous. At 10 miles, Johnston opened fire. Her 5-inch guns barked in rapid succession, sending 55-pound shells screaming toward the Japanese cruiser Kumano at 2,600 feet per second. The shells were absurdly small by battleship standards, but they had one advantage: volume of fire. Johnston's guns could fire 15 rounds per minute. That meant 75 shells in the air every 60 seconds. Most bounced off Kumano's thick armour belt, but some found weak spots. They crashed through the superstructure, exploded in the bridge wings, shredded radar antenna, and started fires. At 7 miles, with Japanese shells landing all around him, throwing up geysers of water 100 feet high, Evans made his firing solution. Range 9,000 yards, bearing 290, spread pattern. His torpedo officer, Lieutenant John Mitchell, locked in the firing solution. "Fish away!" 10 Mark 15 torpedoes launched from Johnston's tubes, each one carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. They hit the water and accelerated to 46 knots, their propellers leaving white wakes pointing directly at the Japanese cruiser Kumano. On Kumano's bridge, the officer of the watch spotted the torpedo wakes. "Torpedoes in the water! Port side!" The cruiser tried to turn, her captain desperately cranking the ship into an emergency turn, but Kumano was massive, 13,000 tons, and she turned like a freight train. 3 torpedoes missed ahead, 2 missed astern, but 5 hit. The explosions were catastrophic. 3 struck below the waterline, ripping open her hull. 2 hit her bow and the entire forward section of the cruiser. Everything ahead of the first turret simply disintegrated. Kumano lurched to a stop, her bow gone, flooding uncontrollably. She was out of the battle and eventually out of the war. One destroyer, built to hunt submarines, had just crippled a heavy cruiser designed to kill battleships. Evans turned Johnston away, zigzagging to avoid return fire. But the Japanese had his range now. At 0730, a trio of 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo bracketed Johnston. 1 missed ahead. 1 missed astern. The third hit. A 14-inch shell weighs 1,400 pounds. When it hits a lightly armoured destroyer at 2,500 feet per second, the result is catastrophic. The shell punched through Johnston's deck, passed through the aft engine room, and exited through the keel before detonating underneath the ship. The explosion lifted the destroyer's entire stern out of the water. It destroyed one of her 2 engine rooms, killed everyone inside instantly, and knocked out all electrical power. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 in seconds. Her main guns went silent, their power feeds cut. More shells hit. A 6-inch round struck the bridge, exploding inside and turning the cramped space into a charnel house. Shrapnel shredded Commander Evans' left hand, and a piece of steel took off 2 of his fingers. The blast threw him against the bulkhead, and he slumped to the deck, bleeding. Lieutenant Hagen, standing 3 feet away, was untouched. He grabbed Evans and dragged him to the remaining chart table. "Skipper, we need to get you to sick bay!" Evans shook his head, blood running down his arm. "Like hell! Get me a bandage and get those engines back online." The bridge was wrecked, open to the sky. Dead men lay across the deck. The communications gear was destroyed, but Johnston was still moving, still fighting. Evans wrapped his mangled hand in a torn shirt and started shouting orders. Without electrical power, Johnston's main guns were manually operated. Crews inside the turrets were cranking the guns by hand, loading shells by muscle power, aiming by looking through optical sights. It was 19th century naval warfare. But they kept firing. 20 miles away, Admiral Kurita was watching the battle develop, and he was confused. His lookouts were reporting torpedo wakes everywhere. Destroyers were charging his line from multiple angles. His fleet was being forced to maneuver wildly to avoid torpedoes, breaking formation, losing cohesion. He'd expected the American destroyers to lay smoke and run. Instead, they were attacking. USS Howell, another Fletcher-class destroyer under Commander Leon Kintberger, had followed Johnston into the charge. Howell had fired all 10 of her torpedoes at the battleship Congo, forcing the massive ship into a desperate turn that took her out of position. Now Howell was taking punishment. Without power to her fire control systems, her crew was firing her guns in local control, each turret aiming and shooting independently. She'd been hit over 40 times. Shells had destroyed her bridge, killed her executive officer, and blown off her mast. She was dead in the water, burning, but her forward guns were still firing. The destroyer Heermann, under Commander Amos Hathaway, had made a torpedo run so close to the Japanese battle line that she'd passed between enemy ships, dodging shells from both sides. She'd fired at the battleship Haruna at 4,500 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, and scored hits before escaping into her own smoke. But it was the destroyer escorts that truly shocked the Japanese. These weren't even real destroyers. They were slow, undergunned, and had no business being in a surface action. Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, should have been sitting in the rear, hiding behind smoke. Instead, Copeland had seen Johnston's charge and made a decision. "All ahead flank, we're going in." His executive officer, Lieutenant Walter Wertheimer, stared at him. "Skipper, we're a DE, we have 2 guns. "Then we'll make them count," Copeland said. Samuel B. Roberts was never meant to fight surface ships. Her 2 5-inch guns were intended for U-boats and aircraft. Her 3 torpedoes, yes, just 3, were an afterthought. But Copeland pushed his ship to 28 knots, far beyond her design speed, the engines redlining. The engineering crew was pouring water on the reduction gears to keep them from seizing. They charged the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. At 5,300 yards, less than 3 miles, Roberts opened fire. Her 2 guns fired as fast as the crew could load them. They were so close that Copeland could see Japanese sailors on Chokai's deck. The destroyer escort's shells, tiny by comparison to what Chokai carried, began landing hits. They struck the cruiser's superstructure, her forward turret, her bridge. One shell penetrated into Chokai's engineering spaces and started a fire that would eventually force her abandonment. Roberts launched her 3 torpedoes. One hit, exploding against Chokai's hull and opening a massive hole. Chokai slowed, listing, and began falling behind the Japanese formation. Then the return fire came. Chokai's 8-inch guns, designed to kill cruisers, found Samuel B. Roberts. The first salvo missed, but the second bracketed her perfectly. 3 shells hit simultaneously. One penetrated the forward engine room and exploded, killing everyone inside and destroying her engines. Another hit the aft 5-inch gun mount, detonating the ready ammunition and blowing the entire gun over the side. The third struck below the waterline and tore a 30-foot hole in her hull. Roberts lost power. She lost propulsion. She was flooding uncontrollably. Copeland stood on what remained of his bridge and looked at his crew. They were still trying to fight. The forward gun, the only one left, was firing in local control. Men were forming bucket brigades to fight fires. The engineering crew was waist-deep in water, trying to shore up the flooding. "Abandon ship," he ordered. It was Aero 935. Samuel B. Roberts had been in combat for less than 2 hours. She'd fired 608 rounds from her 5-inch guns, more than any other DE in history. She'd hit a heavy cruiser over 50 times and put a torpedo into her. A ship designed to hunt submarines had gone toe-to-toe with a cruiser 10 times her size and hurt her badly before dying. As the crew went over the side, Roberts rolled over and sank. 90 men went down with her. Johnston was still fighting. Her steering was shot, so Evans was controlling her with the engines, speeding up the port screw and slowing the starboard to turn. Her bridge was gone, so he was giving orders from the aft deck, shouting through a megaphone. She'd been hit so many times that her hull looked like a sieve, but one gun mount was still operational, and they were firing it manually. A Japanese destroyer squadron spotted Johnston limping along and moved in for the kill. 4 destroyers, fresh and undamaged, closed to 7,000 yards and opened fire. Johnston took hit after hit. A shell penetrated her forward magazine, and the explosion blew out her entire bow section. Another hit destroyed her last engine. She was dead in the water, listing heavily, fires raging. Evans gave the final order. "Abandon ship, all hands over the side." As the crew jumped into the oil-slicked water, a Japanese destroyer captain, Commander Terauchi of the destroyer Yukikaze, did something extraordinary. He ordered his men to salute. The Japanese destroyer passed close by the sinking Johnston, and every man on Yukikaze's deck came to attention and rendered honours to the dying American ship. Terauchi would later write, "That destroyer fought like a battleship. She deserved respect." Johnston sank at 10:10 hours. Of her crew of 327, only 141 survived. Commander Ernest Evans went down with his ship, last seen on the deck as the water closed over her bow. Howell sank at 08:55 after being hit over 40 times. 253 of her crew died. Gambier Bay, one of the escort carriers, was sunk by concentrated fire from Yamato and Congo. She was the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. But by the time she went down, Kurita's fleet was in chaos. His formation was scattered, his cruisers were damaged, his destroyers were out of position, and his carriers, 3 of them, were under attack from an unexpected direction. The American escort carriers, the jeep carriers that were supposed to be helpless, had launched every aircraft they had. Torpedo bombers, fighters, dive bombers, even planes armed with nothing but machine guns, were swarming the Japanese fleet. Several of those planes were carrying something the Japanese didn't know about. Mark 13 aerial torpedoes, modified with new guidance fins, were hitting with devastating accuracy. The escort carrier planes, flying low and slow, were putting torpedoes into Japanese ships that were already damaged and slowed by the destroyer attacks. The heavy cruiser Suzuya took a bomb hit in her engineering spaces and later sank. The heavy cruiser Chikuma was hit by multiple torpedoes from aircraft, flooding badly. She would sink that afternoon. And 3 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains and Kalinin Bay, still afloat and launching planes, sent their aircraft on a coordinated strike against the Japanese heavy carriers that had accompanied Kurita's fleet. Those carriers, Zuikaku, Chitose and Chiyoda, had been sailing behind the battle line. The American planes found them with minimal air cover. Torpedoes from Avenger bombers, guided by the Mark 13's superior tracking, struck home. Chaitos took 2 torpedoes and capsized in minutes. Chiyoda took 3 hits and lost power, dead in the water. She would sink that evening after being torpedoed again by a submarine. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor strike force, took 4 torpedo hits in the span of 10 minutes and went down by the bow, sinking rapidly. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in 90 minutes by planes launched from escort carriers that were supposed to have been sunk in the first salvos of the battle. But those planes had been protected just long enough to launch, protected by 7 tin cans that refused to die quietly. At 0925, Admiral Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered a retreat. His fleet, the most powerful concentration of naval power Japan still possessed, turned away from the vulnerable landing beaches at Leyte Gulf and headed north out of the battle. His officers were stunned. They'd sunk 2 destroyers and a carrier. They'd won the tactical engagement. But Kurita's after-action report captured the psychological reality. The ferocity of the American destroyer attack convinced me I was facing a much larger force, he wrote. The presence of multiple carrier aircraft suggested fleet carriers were nearby. The risk of continuing toward Leyte Gulf was unacceptable. We withdrew. It wasn't true. There were no fleet carriers. There were 6 escort carriers, 3 of which were damaged. But those 7 destroyers had created such chaos, such confusion, that Kurita believed he was facing the main American fleet. His cruisers were damaged, his destroyers were scattered, his formation was broken, and somewhere out there, he thought, were American battleships waiting to ambush him. So he ran. The greatest surface fleet action of the Pacific War ended with the Japanese in retreat, chased away not by battleships or cruisers, but by a handful of destroyers that were never meant to fight capital ships. The mathematics of the battle were staggering. In terms of tonnage, the Japanese had fielded over 200,000 tons of warships. The American screening force totaled less than 20,000 tons. It was a 10-to-1 advantage. In terms of firepower, Kurita's fleet carried 34 major caliber guns, 8-inch or larger. The American destroyers and DEs carried 0. The Japanese had 142 medium guns, 5-inch or larger. The Americans had 35. The Japanese should have annihilated the American force in minutes, proceeded to Leyte Gulf, and massacred the landing force. Instead, they sank 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 1 escort carrier. In return, they lost 3 heavy cruisers, sunk or crippled, and 3 carriers destroyed by the aircraft that the tin cans had protected long enough to launch. The force multiplier was the human element. Commander Ernest Evans charging Yamato in a ship 1/30th its size. Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordering a destroyer escort into a gun battle with a cruiser. The crew of Hoel firing their guns manually after losing power, hitting Congo repeatedly while being blown to pieces. These weren't acts of tactics. They were acts of pure, aggressive audacity. The Japanese had planned for American caution. They'd planned for American doctrine, which said destroyers should lay smoke, fire torpedoes from range, and withdraw. They hadn't planned for 7 commanding officers who looked at a suicide mission and said, "All ahead flank." The story of Taffy 3 became legend in the US Navy. The battle was called the most gallant naval action in US history by Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian. But the impact went beyond legend. After Samar, Japanese naval doctrine was fundamentally altered. Planners noted that American destroyer tactics had become suicidally aggressive. Training emphasized evasive maneuvers against destroyer attacks. The assumption that American destroyers would follow predictable patterns was gone. The psychological impact on Kurita himself was profound. In his post-war interviews, he kept returning to that moment when Johnston charged his fleet alone. "I thought, what kind of enemy is this that charges battleships in destroyers?" he said. "If their destroyers were this aggressive, what would their battleships do? I believed I was sailing into a trap." He hadn't been. But the illusion created by Evans and his fellow commanders was so convincing that it saved thousands of American lives. The landing at Leyte proceeded without naval bombardment. The invasion succeeded. The Philippines were retaken. And the Japanese combined fleet never again attempted a major surface action in the war. They'd been psychologically broken by 7 tin cans, and the men who refused to let them die easy. The cost was staggering in human terms. Of the 7 screening ships, 3 were sunk. The destroyers Johnston, Howell, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts all went down fighting. The destroyer escort Dennis was heavily damaged but survived. The destroyers Herman, Raymond, and John C. Butler, another DE, were all damaged but operational. Total American casualties from the screening force, 1,583 dead, wounded, or missing. Many died in the water, waiting for rescue that took days to arrive. Commander Evans' body was never recovered. Robert Copeland survived. Pulled from the water after 6 hours, he carried survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. "We were never supposed to win that fight," he said in a 1982 interview 2 years before his death. "We were supposed to buy time, maybe 10 minutes, 15 if we were lucky. We bought 2 hours. And we did it by forgetting every tactical doctrine we'd been taught and just charging in like we had a chance." When asked what made the difference, what allowed 7 small ships to turn back a fleet, he paused for a long time. "I think," he finally said, "the Japanese expected us to be rational, to calculate the odds and act accordingly. And we didn't. We acted like every one of those tin cans was the Yamato, and we had the advantage. And for a little while, just long enough, they believed it." The 3 carriers sunk by the aircraft from the escort carriers, Zuikaku, Chitose, and Chiyoda, represented an irreplaceable loss to the Japanese Navy. Zuikaku was the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack. She'd fought at Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz. She was a symbol of Japanese naval power. And she went down off Samar, hit by torpedoes from obsolete Avenger bombers flying from escort carriers. The industrial reality made the victory even more impressive. Japan, by October 1944, had almost no industrial capacity left. They'd lost access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Their shipyards were being bombed. Their steel production was a fraction of 1941 levels. They couldn't replace the ships lost at Samar. America, meanwhile, was building escort carriers at an astonishing rate. The Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, were launching an escort carrier every 5 days. Destroyers were being built in 8 months instead of 18. The destroyer escorts that Japan's admirals had dismissed as tin cans were rolling off assembly lines faster than the Japanese could sink them. In 1944 alone, America commissioned 67 destroyer escorts. Japan built 3 destroyers total. The industrial gap wasn't just about numbers, it was about philosophy. American ships were designed for mass production. They used modular construction, prefabricated sections that could be welded together quickly. They sacrificed elegance for efficiency. Japanese ships were still being built using traditional methods, with each vessel treated as a custom creation. It was craftsmanship versus mass production, and mass production was winning. Today, the wreck of USS Johnston rests in 21,180 feet of water off Samar, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. It was found in 2021 by undersea explorer Victor Vescovo. The footage showed her hull, torn and mangled, but her guns were still pointed toward where the Japanese fleet had been. Even in death, Johnston was still fighting. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only Native American in the Navy to receive it during World War II. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty. Outgunned and outweighed, his ship charged the enemy battle line. Without regard for his own personal safety, Evans closed to point-blank range against ships vastly superior in firepower and armour. His actions were responsible for saving the carriers his ship was assigned to protect." Samuel B. Roberts' wreck was also found in 2022 in 22,916 feet of water, making her the deepest shipwreck ever located. When the discovery was announced, veterans of Taffy 3, the few still alive, released a statement. "She was a tin can," it read. "She was the smallest ship in the battle, and she fought like she was the biggest. That's all we ever asked her to do." The battle off Samar demonstrated a truth that military planners sometimes forget. Superior firepower, superior armour, and superior numbers can be negated by superior aggression and a refusal to accept the expected outcome. The Japanese had every advantage. They should have won. But they were fighting an enemy that didn't believe in should. Commander Evans didn't charge Yamato because he thought he could win. He charged because it was the only move that gave his carriers a chance. Copeland didn't send Samuel B. Roberts into a gun duel with a cruiser because he thought he'd survive. He did it because every minute Chokai was shooting at him was a minute she wasn't shooting at the carriers. The tin cans didn't buy 10 minutes. They bought 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, they turned certain defeat into impossible victory. Admiral Kurita, in his final interview before his death in 1977, was asked if he regretted ordering the retreat from Samar. His answer was surprising. "No," he said. "I regret that I didn't understand what I was facing earlier. I thought I was fighting the American Navy. I wasn't. I was fighting American spirit. You can calculate tonnage and firepower. You can't calculate how hard your enemy will fight when they believe they have something worth dying for. The destroyers at Samar taught me that. Too late, but they taught me." The laughter on Yamato's bridge that morning had turned to silence by noon. The tin cans had the last word. They always did.